Good evening, and welcome back to the 2021 Nelson W. Trout Lectures. This afternoon, we heard a challenging presentation from our keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Beverly Wallace, on the theme, "Do you want to be well? 'Cause wholeness ain't no trifling thing." The necessity of healing work in theological education for authentic diversity. And this evening, we are picking up that theme from a different perspective. Before we move into this evening's program, I'd like to share a few reminders of our schedule. This year's programming is fully online, and it continues tomorrow. On the main stage of this Zoom webinar, I invite you to join us for worship tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and to join us again at 2:30 in the afternoon for a conversation about Womanist Theology. The Zoom link you have used to access today's programs is the same Zoom link you will use tomorrow for the main stage programming. There are also two additional events tomorrow afternoon that require separate registration. This is so that the participants in these additional events are able to participate directly in conversation. First, the Reverend Dr. Kevin Dudley, Senior Affiliated Professor of Church and Society at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, will be convening an esteemed panel of African descent church leaders for conversations about discernment. This conversation is intended only for persons of African descent. The space will be one for sharing, listening, and learning as participants reflect together on how they have experienced God's call in their own lives. The discernment conversations will take place in a private Zoom room. To get that link, you must pre-register, which you can do now or any time up to the start of the sessions. For security reasons, the Zoom link will be shared only with those who register for the discernment conversations, which you can do at tinyurl.com/discernmentpanel. You are welcome to attend either or both discernment conversations, which will take place at 1 o'clock and at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Also, tomorrow afternoon, the 7 seminaries of the ELCA are jointly offering a Bible study on discernment and vocation in conversation with ELCA seminary students. This Bible study will be facilitated by student leaders from Luther and Wartburg seminaries. This will be a delightful and insightful space for learning, interacting, and posing open and honest questions about next steps in considering and responding to God's call. Everyone is invited, no matter where you are in your discernment journey. The Bible study will take place at 3:30 p.m. tomorrow. And like the discernment conversations, you must pre-register for the Bible study, as that is how we will send the Zoom link to you so you can participate actively in the conversation. You can register for the Bible study at tinyurl.com/Bible study ELCA. And now, I am delighted to introduce this evening's program. The subtitle of this year's Trout Lectures is "The Necessity of Healing Work in Theological Education for Authentic Diversity." As we've already heard from Dr. Wallace, authentic diversity in theological education is not just about content, but about who is doing the educating. So this evening, we will be hearing from 3 Black Ph.D. students, each presenting something from their own area of research in the form of a brief TED-style talk. The idea for this programming element came from Dr. Wallace herself. In just the past few years, too many significant, honored Black Lutheran church leaders have gone home to God and to the beloved community of the saints who gather around the throne of glory. As the generations rise and fall, we are keenly aware of the importance of lifting up the voices of new generations of Black leaders in and for the church. This evening, we will hear from 3 doctoral students, the Reverend Kevin Vandiver, Ms. Denise Rector, and Pastor Brian Foulks, who will share with us a sense of how they are each contributing to the important work of theology and theological education. After the talks by each of the 3 presenters, there will be time for conversation amongst the panelists and for questions from you, the viewers. You may type questions at any time in the chat box or the Q&A link of this Zoom webinar. And now, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Vandiver, and I am a PhD candidate in practical theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the ELCA. I'm currently serving as a deployed assistant to Bishop Paul Eggensteiner in the Metropolitan New York Synod, but I've also served as a pastor mission developer in Harlem, as well as a director of family ministries in one of our churches in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm happy to be with you today to share. I'd like to thank the people in leadership at the Trout Lectures to help to make this happen, and especially grateful and thankful to and for Dr. Beverly Wallace, who has taken the task of creating opportunities for ELCA scholars of color very seriously. Do you want to be made well? I'm hoping that we do. I'm hoping in this short time to tell you a little bit more about how I am situated in my discipline as a scholar, minister, and practitioner. There is a long history of Lutheran pastors who share these designations, and I am proud to be a part of the work of reforming the church. So I said to you before that I'm a practical theologian. Well, what in the world is that? There are as many definitions for practical theology as there are practical theologians, and I won't bore you with a whole bunch of history moving from antiquity to Schleiermacher and beyond. Don't get me wrong, I love history, but that would take up this entire talk and some. And plus, that may make things a little bit dry. Suffice it to say that practical theology is like a loop. Pretend you're riding in a car and you've been trained as a mechanic. Suddenly, the car violently shakes, sputters, and completely gives out. Well, what do? You're a mechanic, remember? And you're a really good mechanic at that. Well, you'll pull the lever to pop up the hood, prop it up, and take a look. You're already using your diagnostic tools to begin to assess what's really going on here. You plug in a wire. You walk to the ignition, turn the crank, give it a little gas. It sputters, but doesn't quite turn over. You walk back to the hood and you suddenly notice that the battery casing has suddenly become loose, and one of the connectors to the battery nodes has been dislodged after you'd hit an especially sizable pothole. You go to the trunk, you get your wrench, you place the connection onto the battery node, tighten it with your wrench, get back into the car, turn the key in the ignition, and boom, the car starts right up. What did you do? You were riding in the car, it broke down, you did some diagnostic work, you engaged in some kind of method to address the issue. That didn't work. So you went back to the drawing board with that prior decision that didn't work, helping to inform you towards finding a solution that does. Now, I'd still say that this may be a little bit of a reductionist view of what a practical theologian does, but it is a good entry point into what I am trained to do. We look at situations which are going on in the world and we analyze them with our tools. Those tools can be manifold. Some use theology, some use scripture, some use tradition, some use social sciences of some kind. Depending upon your slant or your training, you may use one or all of these, giving more or less weight as appropriate. While practical theology has often been relegated as theological ambulance chasing, where we're just fixing problems with our tools, we do more than that. We see the ways that God is working in and through the world, and it is our aim to ever expand God's kingdom here on earth, which means all of our work doesn't just deal with bad stuff. We can identify, for instance, phenomena which are good and say, more of that. Practical theology works along a theory-praxis continuum. Your theory informs your practice, informs your theory, informs your practice. When you were under the hood and you realized that the bad wire wasn't the problem that stopped the car, even though it definitely is something you need to look at some point, that realization or theory informed what you did next, and what you did next informed the next theory when you went back to the hood and saw the battery disconnected. Practical theology is not just simply theology with on-the-ground aims or ends. No, all theology originally had on-the-ground aims: worship and love of God and the cultivation of good community. It is not a subset of theology or other theological disciplines. It is practical theology because of this back and forth relationship with theory and practice. Practice informs your theory, informs your practice, like a circle. In addition to this, practical theology often combines several disciplines and reaches across the aisle, marrying both theological and secular. I put this in air quotes, another conversation for another day. Theological and secular modes to arrive at some form of conclusion. Okay, I'm trying not to get too heavy. I know we're talking to a wide swath of people, so just bear with me. I hope not to get too into the weeds, because that gets a little boring. But here we are. My discipline is practical theology. We've got that. My discipline has several subsets, and the main ones are Christian education, homiletics or preaching, and pastoral theology. Sometimes you'll see liturgics, mission-oriented designations, and other subcategories, but the first three have been around since Schleiermacher did work on them, trying to convince the German university that there was a place for theology in the academy. I know I said I wouldn't talk about them, but I just had to squeeze it in here. My area of specialty is homiletics, or the art of preaching. Preaching is more than just standing and delivering a sermon, and even more than diligent weekly study. One of the underpinnings which upholds the practice of preaching is what we call hermeneutics. Simply put, hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. So preaching is undergirded or supported by interpretation. And not only do we interpret texts, but we interpret contexts, where and how people are in the world, what conditions they are in, and we interpret the world itself. So the art of preaching and understanding the world and everyone in it becomes the goggles that I use to look under the hood. And I look under all sorts of hoods. American Christianity has a hood. African American Christianity has a hood. The ELCA has a hood. Churches in the ELCA have hoods. And as a trained theologian, I look through my goggles and I use my tools to find ways to change the landscape. Hermeneutics, or the art of interpretation, is especially helpful for me because I can use interpretation not in just teaching, preaching, or in looking at texts. Now, everybody and everything becomes a text that I can look at closely. I can look at something that seems out of place because I have my interpretive goggles, which asks, what is happening here? Then, come close. I'm going to tell you what's in my toolbox. I'll use theology, tradition, social science, critical race theory, Black and Womanist theology, and homiletics, and all other kinds of stuff to come up with solutions or ways to make God's kingdom bigger in the world. Case in point, I wrote a long paper a couple of years back about visions and expectations. Visions and Expectations was the document that kind of set the bounds for clergy behavior. Now, we've heard some people doing some theological work about visions and expectations and its complication with sexuality, most notably people in the queer community. But I was also able to locate some issues with the document in regard to assumptions about fiscal responsibility. The document ties a minister's financial stability to good moral virtue, a la what I would liken to Aristotelian virtue ethics. This sounds good on a surface level, but to tie a minister's goodness to their ability to meet their financial obligations doesn't get down into the depths of the realities of increased student loan burdens for clergy of color, less moneyed calls for clergy of color, less financial support from home congregations, and the list goes on. So a Black seminarian who does not have the same financial backing as one of her white peers goes into more debt and winds up in a call that cannot afford to even pay her at synodical guidelines. It's a never-ending cycle, isn't it? And it speaks beyond moral goodness to something more insidious. How some get and others don't, how we're able to clearly see these patterns afoot and how these patterns repeat over and over again. And if we're not careful, for the sake of good order, we'll call somebody into the bishop's office and tell them, Kevin, you've been flagged by Churchwide for indebtedness. It happened and it was super embarrassing. I'm not saying no to accountability. I'm asking who was in the room where it happened, where the decisions got made. Yikes. This document, which was never even supposed to be juridical, was formed by people who never intended that these would be the consequences. And this is only one example of how our documents, theological interpretations, worship orientations and practices, seminary faculty and student makeup should ever be subject to having their hoods opened up and examined. As quiet as it's kept. The making of rules and regulations based off of the life experience of the privileged and dominant group or ruling class of people has historically been white people in our country. Making these rules and applying them to everybody while tying one's ability to abide by the behavior to issues of morality is a nod toward privilege at best and white supremacy at worst. You're only good enough if you can do it like I can. I am the standard for how you should live. I know we don't like the words white supremacy, but when the dominant culture's privileges subsume the life stories of those who, by and large, do not have that same experience, and suddenly, by no fault of their own, a person who is Black or brown is no longer virtuous because of the hand that they were dealt or not dealt, and that these are identified problems that are not remedied and have not been remedied is evidence that somebody needs to look under the hood. And even white people suffer from this creation of a good and fiscally responsible minister. The same standards of privilege choke everybody, collateral damage. Who was the litmus test, the paragon for the making of these rules? Look under the hood. And as we get further down under the hood, we see that a lot of things, as they have existed for decades and even longer, sound good on the surface. But when I put on my goggles and look under the hood, there is severe structural and institutional damage that needs to be remedied, and God has given you and me the tools. So, do you want to be made well? An old preacher told me one time that even if you lecture, because this is a lecture, if you're a preacher, you should always endeavor to preach a little bit. Now, I'm not preaching here, but what strikes me about this passage is that Jesus, the answer, is asking a question for which he is the answer. But in asking the question, he is granting the person in need of healing agency. I'm the answer. I am here, but do you want to be made whole? In the particular story that I'm thinking of, the man opts into the process of being made whole, thereby allowing he who is in need the opportunity to have agency in his own healing. I talked about hermeneutics, but didn't spend a lot of time on preaching itself, didn't I? Well, here it is. Preaching happens every week and even more often, at least in our churches. Preaching is an immediate game changer. Some of us had to go without the sacrament pairing of the word and sacrament liturgy for a while with the pandemic raging, but we still received the word during that time, the word through the proclamation of God's message. Preaching has several valences, definitions, and trajectories, just like practical theology. And I submit to you that there is a certain kind that we must do if we want to be made well. I won't bore you with all the details, but buckle your seatbelts. It might get a little thick around here. But and besides that, we don't have much time. But homiletician Lucy Rose traced different paradigms of preaching over time, with the last one that she takes up for her own model being called transformational preaching. During the emergence of this paradigm, which has emerged over the last 35 to 40 years or so, several things were happening, but basically, homiletics began to absorb the idea of preaching as performative speech. Gerhard Ebeling and Ernst Fuchs had generated the new hermeneutic, which spoke of the eventfulness of language and the need to recreate the event in interpretive practice. And preaching moved to hermeneutic concerns, asking, how do people understand? How do we understand? How do we understand the world? And at the same time, theologians were discovering that the idea of universal theologies were a misnomer. There is no theology, only contextual theology, says Stephen Bevins. Theologies which we uphold as just theology are contextually centered around white male worldviews. So other worldviews began to be considered in the preaching enterprise, and preaching was not just another long list of the liturgy, it was an event. All of these factors came together to create the paradigm of transformative preaching. In the God-human relationship, the human is responsible. The human preacher is responsible for facilitating the conditions whereby the hearer can experience an event with God in the sermon. Theologically, with the aforementioned breaking down of universal theologies, the transformational paradigm has several theologies which drive the engine of the word event. Black liberationist theologies, neo-orthodox theologies, fundamentalist theologies, existentialist theologies, and liberalist theologies. Instead of just theology, we now know that there are strains of theology which power our lenses toward proclamation. I'm saying all that to say that I believe preaching to be a transformative event that is in time, but also, as Rudolf Bultmann would say, it transcends time. Preaching is the place and the moment in time where lives are transformed through the charismatic moment where the glory of the infinite God is revealed. Do you want to be made well, Jesus asks? Well, folks at Trout, here it is. I'm finally there. Somebody has got to say something. We can look under the hood and use all of our tools and worldviews to analyze the situations that lie before us, but unless someone says something, unless someone proclaims, there is no event, there is no transformation. We've done well with preaching good, theologically solid sermons. We're good at proclaiming the detached and heady stuff. We're good at letting our schooling shine through. And you can tell that Lutherans take the moment of proclamation very seriously. Please understand, I'm not knocking our preaching practice, but have we also all as a collective spoken about the ills that we have found under the hoods? Are we even looking under the hoods at all? Under our hoods, under the denomination's hood, under our church's hood, under the hood in our house, under the hood of our political leanings? Have we allowed the goggles that God has granted us and others to take a close look at ourselves? Do we stay quiet or do we proclaim? It is my eventual hope to share my goggles with students I would one day teach in our seminaries, but make no mistake about it, nobody gets a pass because we are the priesthood of all believers. And if you can't preach a sermon, you can certainly live one. That is where transformation lives. When we proclaim, it creates an event. You use your agency, your voice, to create an eventful meeting with God. I'm dedicated to interrogating and searching under the hood of our church as a Black practical theologian. We have some work to do, don't we? We've not always gotten it right, but no one has. The question is today, do you want to be made well? There are answers among us coming from voices all around, voices who have previously been silenced for whatever reason. We must attend to the realities of the structural damage under our hood, which is fueled by white supremacy, which covertly infiltrates the air we breathe, surrounding us all in a ubiquitous fog. We must literally put our money and resources where our mouths are and make sure that the right people are teaching and leading us, like what's happening with this series in Dr. Wallace. Do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well? It will cost you something. Maybe privilege. Maybe it'll cost some pride. Maybe it'll actually cost some money. Maybe you'll lose some friends when you proclaim. Maybe you may be alienated from family members. Maybe you'll get called into the bishop's office. Who knows? Maybe, though, and the question is the hope that if you give up your current existence through Jesus Christ, the answer, you can get an even better one that looks at the problems under the hood, but addresses them in proclamation in such a way which opens up the world for the last, the lost, and the least, for all of God's children to sit at the banquet table and dine. Do you want to be made well? Amen.
Hello, my name is Denise Rector, and I am a third-year Ph.D. student at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. My area of study is theological ethics. I am a Womanist Lutheran ethicist with an interest in history, and in my presentation today, I'm going to break down those parts, Womanist, Lutheran, ethicist, and history, and talk a bit about how those parts inform each other and shape my research. First, Womanist Theology. The creator, the mother of Womanist Theology, is Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. What her scholarship brought to theology was the idea that my particular embodiment is relevant to questions of ethics and theology. My experience as a U.S. born and raised Black woman is not only relevant, it's essential. When doing theology, you do it differently as a Black woman. You should do it differently as a Black woman. Now, we talk a lot about social location these days, but the concept of centering theology around something other than westernized or European white male experience is still even today slowly sinking into theological thinking and pedagogy. And that's evident when you see how many women of color or how many LGBTQIA plus authors there are on a class syllabus, or holding professorships in religion, or even holding the position of pastor in a church. So you can imagine how revolutionary and novel this idea of social location was in the late 80s when Reverend Dr. Cannon wrote Black Womanist Ethics. Even though the term social location wasn't widely used when she was writing, the idea is key to her work. And because the Academy had not centered the experience of people like Dr. Cannon or me, who were both Black females, Cannon's research also relied on a fresh methodological approach. Part of centering the experience of U.S. born Black women means looking at the history of Black women in this country. It would be obvious to examine history as a subject, and she did. The other interesting thing that she did was center and examine Black women's experience by looking at the fiction of Black women novelists. To me, this is full circle thinking because it was a Black woman novelist, Alice Walker, who coined the term womanist in the first place. It's a term with a full 4-part definition that I encourage you to go take a look at and dwell on when you have a chance. So we see how canon is using and extending the work of Walker by identifying as a womanist. The other author canon studies is Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston's novels offer an intimate look at the lives of Black women, their family connections, their concerns, their love relationships, their work and economic issues, and their dreams and aspirations. All of these facets of life involve ethical decisions, and our social location influences how we choose to live out our ethics in those facets of life. In other words, canon saw in Hurston's writing, Hurston's characters, the living situations, the economic situations they were in, canon saw in that a way to discuss ethical issues important in the lives of Black women. And canon found a way to do that theologically. I stated earlier that Alice Walker was the creator of the term womanist, and I want to add one more thing to that. When Zora Neale Hurston died in 1960, her remains were placed in an unmarked grave. Alice Walker in 1972 found Hurston's grave and had a marker put there. And I want to make 2 sort of meta points about womanism with this story. Meta point 1, what makes Walker's finding of Hurston's grave and putting a marker there, what makes all that more than just kind of like a cool fact is the fact that we're talking about respect for and agency of Black women. So we have this sad story about Hurston and her remains being in an unmarked grave. So was that a reflection of how people thought of her work or her at the time? To have Alice Walker see this injustice, see this unethical treatment of Hurston's memory, and then move to fix this unethical treatment, that is a great illustration of, it's a very practical illustration of Black women centering themselves and employing their ethical agency. And meta point number 2 that is related, we have novelist Alice Walker, who in 1972 does this, finds Hurston's grave, puts a marker there, and then in 1983 coins the term womanist. And then we have Katie Geneva Cannon, who comes along in 1988 with her dissertation, identifying herself as a womanist, and then using Hurston as a source for understanding the lives and ethics of Black women. And the way the writing and the way these women, these Black women intersect is so womanist. It's so womanist. It illustrates what it means to reach back and bring important knowledge forward that can be used in the present and in the future. Alice Walker reached back and did an ethical act for Zora Neale Hurston by marking her grave. Canon reached back to Walker's term womanist and identified herself as womanist, and then reached back to Hurston's writing to bring it forward in this dissertation that she writes in 1988. All of this reaching back and bringing forward, this is Sankofa. This is a term that talks about bringing things from the past and bringing them forward because they are needful for a community and because they will help a community thrive in the present and in the future. And this is what Black women do. This is what these 3 Black women are doing. And this idea of Sankofa, of reaching back and bringing forward and then building, is also reflected in my thoughts about epistemology, which I'll talk about in just a minute towards the end of this presentation. I'm going to move now to the Lutheran part of Womanist Lutheran ethicist. My Womanist theology informs my Lutheranism. Justification by grace through faith is a central belief and understanding for me and for my theology and for Lutheran theology. Martin Luther's work, Freedom of a Christian, is a text that informs my understanding of theological ethics. Christ's gift of justification is given to us by grace through faith. There's nothing that we can do to earn it. We can only receive it by faith. And because we do not have to work for justification, indeed, because we cannot work for justification, Freedom of a Christian states that we are then free to serve our neighbor with good works. So ethical action, in this instance, means doing good works to help the neighbor. And we do that knowing that these works can't get us into heaven. We don't anxiously try to earn heaven by doing good things for people. Instead, as Lutherans, we live this lifelong mystery of freely accepting this gift we don't deserve and can't earn. And in the meantime, we serve our neighbor to better God's creation, to make God's creation better. In my denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA, one way that we foster discussion around ethical questions is by producing social statements and social messages. And this is a way for us to bring together Lutheran doctrine, scriptural interpretation, and also faithful deliberation and discernment. The goal of theological ethics, in my mind, is to ascertain and to articulate how humans should best treat each other and the rest of God's creation. Christian theological ethics discerns how belief in and presence of God in human life affects how we humans live and how we treat creation. So looking at the history of theological ethical thought, I think it's clear that there's a line or a connection or a progression that moves from philosophical ethics through ancient and modern Christian ethics to liberation theological ethics, including womanist theological ethics. I'm bringing this part up to discuss James Cohn and Gustavo Gutierrez, who both looked at their social situations and saw that the prevailing understanding of theology at the time centered white people, especially white men, as the norm. Both Cohn and Gutierrez, working separately, crafted theologies that centered their social situations and the situation of the poor and the oppressed. They stated that theology looks different when you're oppressed, and that you can't fully see or study God without recognizing God's identification with the oppressed and recognizing God's desire to liberate the oppressed. And Katie Geneva Cannon was a student of James Cohn's. So just like we connected philosophy and this progression to ancient ethics, modern ethics, and theology and liberation theology, I want to make the same sort of progression or connection with the people studying and writing about theology. I could do that by going all the way back to St. Augustine, who was African, and Augustine's influence on Luther. I'm not going to go back quite that far. I'm going to instead start sort of mid-century, mid-20th century. James Cohn was responding to theologians and writers like Reinhold Niebuhr because Cohn didn't see his experience reflected in Niebuhr's theology. Cohn didn't see Cohn's own experience reflected in Niebuhr's theology. And Cannon was a student of Cohn's, and while she saw the Black experience in the liberation theology that Cohn was bringing forward, she didn't see the experience of Black women. So this leads to the idea that today we would call intersectionality, which was just sort of coming online through critical race theory and critical legal theory around the late 80s and early 90s. But this concept of intersectionality and these overlapping oppressions are very much present in everything Katie Geneva Cannon wrote, even if the term intersectionality didn't come online until mid to late 90s or even after that. I made the point about the Niebuhr-Cohn-Cannon progression because I wanted to make it clear how past knowledge builds on knowledge and then builds on it some more. because that is central to some of the epistemological questions that I'm asking in my research. Since I'm a Black woman in a denomination that is over 90% white, it may not come as a surprise that the construction of ideas around race is of interest to me. I earned my Master of Divinity from Wartburg Theological Seminary, and my master's thesis for that degree discussed the difference between equity and diversity. When questions of race come up, I think that a lot of people talk about diversity as a way of sort of leveling the playing field and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. In my mind, equity is critical, much more critical than diversity, because equity is about power sharing, not just having a seat at the table, but being able to speak and impact decisions and have agency and lead. So in that thesis work, I looked at the leadership of Black women in the church, and I also ended up looking at U.S. Lutheran history. And the more history I read, the more Lutheran history I read, the more interested I got, because I almost never saw people who looked like me in U.S. Lutheran history. I almost never saw people who looked like me writing or teaching U.S. Lutheran history. And the experiences centered in Lutheranism didn't match a lot of my experience. So I began to consider the impact that historiography, what we know, has. I began to consider the impact that historiography has on epistemology. The impact that historiography has on epistemology. In other words, I began to wonder if the stories that we tell about history, the narratives, I began to wonder how they affect what we know and how we know it. And basically, the question that I'm always asking myself is, whose knowledge is authoritative and why? Whose story is being told and why? That question is a question of theological ethics, because we build on what we know to learn new things. My theological stance is that God is creator and that we, created by God, are co-creators with God. And being a co-creator bears an ethical responsibility. If we employ historical or historiographical narratives without asking if they are ethical in their representation of people's experience, then we are misusing those narratives. And our misuse of those narratives, picking up those narratives without seeing if they are true to the experience of the social location of people whose stories are not privileged, of people who have been oppressed, when we misuse those narratives without doing that discussion of whether or not they are really true to people's experience, using narratives incorrectly then has a negative impact on our relationship with God, with our status as co-creator, and also has a negative impact on the rest of creation, how we see our fellow humans. So it is my hope that this discussion of epistemology around the idea of womanist Lutheran ethics provides some innovative ways for you to consider questions of ethics in light of both social location in general and womanist theology and Lutheran theology in particular. Thank you.
Good day to everyone. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my conversation here about my work and research in this particular Trout presentation. They asked us to talk about some of the things that we are doing in our particular studies. My name is Brian Foulks. by the way. I am a Ph.D. student at Chicago Theological Seminary, and my field is Black religious thought and culture. My work is centered around the unmaking within the Theo-Creative, while I wrestle with James Baldwin and John Coltrane. And what I am thinking about is working on this concept that centers around the fact that art is not only dangerous, but it dismantles, and it also creates, and potentially that work unearths the deepest form of beauty in the foulest of places. And that's kind of working off Toni Morrison, or what she denotes as art that requires a critical conversation about being human. In comparison, art as a theological practice, envision God as a disciplined creator, creating within the infinite and the borderless. And James Baldwin kind of rips off this and kind of takes this a little further in his lecture, The Moral Responsibility of the Artist. And he says he wrestles with the collision that occurs when the invented God of America and the creative vision of the artist begins to ask questions of humanity. He refers to this event as a collision to represent an emphatic reiteration, as he proclaims, because people don't want to see their deepest intimations confirmed. Baldwin views artists as probably the only people who can really bring society into a place, because they are the few who choose to be honest and tell the truth about what's happening in the world. He sees artists as the ones having the ability to galvanize the creativity, to exegete from the captive space of the ugly. In other words, the artists have been blessed with the foresight to see the beauty within the grotesque. We also find this type of reverence or foresight in the artistry of John Coltrane, During our interview, John Coltrane tells the interviewer, he says, I want to develop a method that if it's not raining, I can play and it starts to rain. If my friend needs money, I can play. It develops some sound, and money will come in an abundance form. Or if they're sick, I could play, and music will provide a form of healing, because he understood that art had this particular way of perfecting things that were imperfect. The unmaking of the Theo-Creative for Baldwin and Coltrane embodies an engagement of unhinging from the white gaze, while simultaneously embracing how the Black experience has been cultivated by the community. Now, the Theo-Creative is the artist being consciously inspired by the moment, while their creative response assumes transcendence. Therefore, the Theo-Creative is not merely a moment, a movement, or an occurrence. It is also the person. It's the artist understanding how their artistry cultivates and reconfigures. The Theo-Creative is where art expands the conversation, while theologically struggling to provide solutions for what George Yancey describes as the quotidian social spaces. So you could see this in the work, maybe a Public Enemy in the Black Steel of Chaos, or John Coltrane's Alabama, where he plays out sonically the speech of Martin Luther King in Alabama. This is what is art performing as an unmaking, a reconfiguring of the space to become a proponent of Black eruptions. The unmaking within the Theo-Creative conjures an artistic moment where perfection is not automatically centered on social cultural vocabulary, as denoted by A. Sean Crowley. Rather, the most important factor becomes, how does art register in the spirit of the people? Simply put, how does it make you feel? So the unmaking within the Theo-Creative forms a distrust, a radicality, and a subversive disposition which dominate ideologies and theologies that refuse to interrogate white European gaze. And as one of my professors, Dr. Joanne Terrell, says, it's an artist, being an artist is a given, becoming conscious of one's artistry and becoming conscientious as an artist depends on having or developing a sacramental theory of perception. Terrell readily designates that the sacramental aspect of art must first be secured within the artist and the artist's gaze, therefore not merely offering a response, but producing a work. So in this work that gets this kind of this disruptive clarity, as Ed Pavlich calls it, and practice becomes the thing that is most important. So you find John Coltrane consciously, almost methodically, and in this maniacal form, practicing on a religious basis, 10 to 12 hours a day. Even if he couldn't blow sounds, he would be in the bathroom fingering the horn, or in his bedroom fingering the horn, because, as Lewis Porter says, that it is essential for improvisation, since one must hear music in one's head in order to produce it at will. And James Baldwin, as this kind of progenitor of Black rage, an artist who was a progenitor of Black rage, this description as an outright artist reflects heavily upon his genius and his creativity. So the artist would avail his artistic world would avail his imagination unto a wider perspective from which he was able to extract the information. Baldwin proclaimed in a conversation with Stutz Terkel, nobody knows what's going to happen to themselves from one moment to the next, or how they will hear it or bear it. This is irreducible, and it is true for everybody. Now, it is true that the nature of society has to be, to create among its citizens an illusion of safety, but it is also absolutely true that safety is necessarily an illusion, and artists are here to disturb the peace. So Baldwin uses art as a way to arrange moments for people to communicate their truth, even in the midst of oppressive times. Ed Pavlich says it like this: art puts people eye to eye with the essential state of risk and made an enraged joy possible. And this is the beauty and the unmaking of the Theo-Creative work of James Baldwin. He is constantly reworking the accusation that God abandons Black people and allows these atrocities to dismantle the lives of Black folks. So Black rage then serves as his Theo-Creative form to release his artistic expression, which then revises his understanding of the Imago Dei. And Baldwin then places this rage upon God and his Father. Nevertheless, God, through the church, appears to have been has made an impact on Baldwin, because he, along with Coltrane, believes that they never get rid of that. In the liner notes of Love Supreme, John Coltrane writes, during the year of 1957, I experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening. And with this awakening, a much richer, fuller, more productive life. And at that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. So we find Coltrane now taking on this ontological perspective of being music and having music and art embodied into himself, so much that his wife, Naima, at the time says he became 90% saxophone. And so Coltrane's theocratic movements or moments are centered around his relationship with the saxophone. And so this collision between the saxophone and Coltrane begins to play out, because he's living he's trying to reimagine fatherhood and relationship, because his father, his maternal grandparents, and his uncle passed within months of each other. And this is prior to him picking up the saxophone. And so for Coltrane, playing meant this was this way of finding righteousness. And he found salvation through the saxophone, as Ashley Cohn says. So the Theo-Creative for both Coltrane and Baldwin, they have these particular entities in their life. For Baldwin, is the typewriter, and for Coltrane, it's the saxophone. Baldwin was afraid to go to the typewriter because he knew that was his place where it was kind of this chaotic love affair, where he had to release the sacred thoughts that were in him, but it was also this opportunity to manufacture this type of anguish that was attacking him. So he was always had this opportunity to go and share, as he calls it, this kind of passionate detachment that was happening. Coltrane, for him, it was an opportunity to get back in close connection with his family. The sudden deaths of all his family, his father particularly, appeared to leave an aperture to which the saxophone could creatively satisfy. Coltrane's love for the saxophone, as I said previously, put him at a place where he would practice 12 hours a day. It was Wayne Shorter, the great jazz musician, says that his grandfather was a preaching, and I can hear the wailing through the horn and the appreciation for his grandfather's mission. And so Shorter is positing an inevitable resurgence of spirituality that emerges through the artistry of Coltrane as he is chasing lost time with the men, his father and the father figures in his life. So I conclude with this. The unmaking within the Theo-Creative is Black performance awakening to the historical value of culture, because art produces itself in the means of the crumpled and the creases of struggle. Black folks have and had to be creative in order to survive. Baldwin and Coltrane are products of a people, whereas Fred Moten denotes, Black performance was a means and a practice of resistance. With Blackness and God servicing as a connected, never-ending muse, the quest to reshape humanity avails itself as a total disruption for these two artists. Their art mimetically induced their lives, or in the words of Sonny Rollins, I'm not supposed to be playing. The music is supposed to be playing me. I'm just supposed to be standing here with the horn, moving my fingers. The music is supposed to be coming through me. That's when it's really happening. And that, my friends, is what I believe theological education does in the future. It's coming through me, and it is kind of using the theologian as an instrument. Thank you.
Dr. Wallace, who is sitting there beaming with pride, as I mentioned in the introduction, she's the one who did this. And it's unfortunate that Pastor Vandiver can't be with us this evening, but we're so grateful that he did submit a presentation. I'm sure some questions and comments will come in, but y'all have been working together for a while. I want you to talk about what you saw and heard and comment on each other's work and lift things up. And any questions, we'll give you
I'm going first. I'm going first. And I'm bringing our brother Kevin into the room. He asked a question. I'm going to ask this of you, Denise, and you, Brian. He says somebody needs to look under the hood. So when you look under the hood, what's the work that you got to do? The work your soul must have.
I would defer to Denise.
I see you, Brian. Brian, it's real
Centering Black women's experience.
Thank you, Dr. Kleinhans. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Brian, I'm so glad to be on the program with you.
Same here.
We've mentioned Kevin. What work do I see under the hood that needs to be done? Since I am coming from a womanist vein, the first work that I feel needs to be done is attention and centering of healing for Black folk, for Asian folk, for Native American folk, for Hispanic Latinx folk, for Arab American folk, for the folk that society has tried to marginalize and tried to label. We have our own healing and our own thriving that needs to be attended to. And so looking under the hood, if I don't see those places for healing or those ways for healing, I want to work to put those ways of healing in for me and for people like me, and even for people that aren't like me, but who still need healing. So what's missing from the healing menu and what can we put in? You might have expected the answer, well, we just need to fix the system. The system needs attention, yes, but we also need healing. And so much time fixing a system might not leave enough time for the healing and thriving to give us the energy that we need to fix the system. So that's where I am. That's where I'm going to land for now with that question, and I will turn it over to my colleague, soon to be Doc Brian.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wallace, for the invitation. Sister Denise, good to see you. It's been a year or so, or maybe 2 years since I left Chicago.
It's been a minute, yeah.
And let me just give a disclaimer. If I get excited, I'm not sure what I'll say. So I don't want people to be, I've had a few folks mad. They mute me. But really, I don't know if, I'm just about tearing the damn hood off and being done with it. So we don't have to look under it anymore. I mean, because I know the healing part is for folks like Denise who have that type of configuration to do so. I'm a little too blunt for that. I'm out to deconstruct, to rebuild, because the system is broken. So it's no need to try to fix it. It's all about destroying it, and then we can start again. But you need to let folks come in there and understand they're healed. And once we are healed, then we can move to the liberation, the liberative moments, the liberative movements to do the real deconstruction. Because one thing I'm finding out, you can't really be free unless you're healed. You can't speak freedom. You can't talk free and say certain things unless you understand there is a need for this healing. That's because you understand that I won't get invited to certain places and spaces. I won't be liked by people. So, once you tear the hood up, tear the hood off, we don't have those issues. And so we need folks like Kevin to look under the hood, and tell us what needs healing. And then folks like Denise to heal us, and then folks like me just to tear the hood off.
And then, so when we're all healed, we can go, oh yeah, there's Brian. There's where we're headed. And we just get, yeah. So the Spirit gives many gifts. We all have our part, and we all need each other for this work. So
right,
yeah.
Right. The Congolese have a word called the imbongi, the house with no walls. And so everybody brings their genius to the room, to the space, and we all just kind of eat from the genius, and there are no egos. You bring your part to the space, and we all get it in.
Mm-hmm. We have everything that we need.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Wallace, which is where you were with this afternoon, we have everything that we need.
Mm-hmm.
I am in the situation of being on a panel and chatting about the panel at the same time, because we all just eat from the genius was too good. I had to get that in the chat because that's it. Thank you, Brian.
Dr. Wallace and I were actually chatting amongst ourselves about how these talks the three of you have given are pretty good samples for teaching job interviews at some point. And I want to come back to where Pastor Foulks ended. Actually, I know Ms. Rector and I are both baseball fans, right? So I'm going to draw on an image there and say, white people like to talk about how Jackie Robinson was, the one who broke the color barrier. Jackie Robinson was a great ball player, but it wasn't that there hadn't been other great black ball players. Jackie Robinson was the first one that white people let back into the major leagues, right?
Right.
And there's a whole history of professional Negro League baseball before that. So, I'm thinking, Pastor Foulks, of your comment at the end about just as the music plays the instrument, theological education plays through you. And I'm thinking about how people like those of you in the panel have not always been welcomed in teaching positions and in preaching. Okay, that was like a way understatement, not always. Anyway, but so I'm thinking, if you're when you're allowed to play the game, and I'm hearing you say you're not going to be allowed, you're going to force your way in, and I applaud that. But how, just like baseball was different once white supremacy was being attacked, how is theological education going to be different when people like the three of you are the ones in the classroom shaping the conversation with students? When theological education is playing you as an instrument instead of playing these classical white instruments over here.
Can I add to that real quick? We were on the same page, Dr. Kleinhans. Because my question is, if you could create a course of study, what would it look like?
Mm.
Yeah, I'll try to answer the first one and let Denise answer the hard one, the second part, because she's brilliant. I'll try my best to answer that second part. But the baseball analogy is interesting, because I actually played. That was my first career. I was a professional athlete with the Los Angeles Dodgers, and I remember going into spring training that first year, seeing all those pictures of Jackie Robinson on the wall. But then I remember also playing in California with my white teammates. We all lived in the same apartment, and I had just gotten into this in some part of California. I can't remember the city, and they were going on a road trip. I couldn't go because I had just gotten there, and because I had just been traded to this team. And one of my white teammates said, Brian, don't steal from us while we're going. Now, and I say that because though Jackie Robinson may have broke the color barrier, the color line, it didn't change anything. Folk was still racist as all outdoors. And as you said, Jackie Robinson wasn't probably in the top 10 of best baseball players in the Negro Leagues. But what he was, he knew how to play the game well enough and take the BS that was coming. And so you had people like Satchel Paige, who would come later, and Josh Gibson, who was the best baseball player in the Negro Leagues. But those cats weren't going to take that BS. So they were actually had just as many fans in the Negro Leagues at that time, but they just weren't making the money and didn't have the national exposure. And so what I'm saying with theological education, you have to make a decision whether you want to feed your family or whether you want to just honor your people. And I'm not mad at anybody that want to feed their family, and I'm not mad at anybody that want to honor their people. Because I catch it because I try to honor the people. But there also comes that moment when you say, how long can I sustain this? Mm-hmm. And that's where I am with theological education, and not just theological education, but anything in the academy, because the academy is kind of like the quarterback in the NFL. The quarterback is not, the person is not changing the quarterback position. The position of quarterback changes the quarterback. Mm-hmm. That's why they say you have to be a person that passes from the pocket. Mm-hmm. You can't be a runner. I mean, that's just how it is. So I like to think that we can change it. The only way we're going to change it is if all of us go to HBCUs. Mm. The second part of that, I would like to teach a class on the Black liberation in nonfiction. That's something and how that looks, you know.
Yeah.
That's one, because that's a hard one.
Yeah. One of the pieces that I'm working on right now is looking at the relationship between Janelle Monae and Octavia Butler.
Mm. I'm going to share something with y'all. I told him I was going to steal it, but a friend of mine, he was in the Ph.D. program with me. Dr. Ray hit him with something and says, why don't you write a piece? Because we actually worked on his dissertation questions and we were working back and forth. And I said, you know, talk about James Baldwin's conversation with the theologian. You said his name earlier, Denise. Niebuhr. Baldwin's conversation with Niebuhr. And then talk about the Good Times episode that displayed Ned the Wino as Black Jesus. And he said, so he put it in his question, and he said, Dr. Ray came and told him later, said, why don't you write an essay called Can Ned the Wino Save White Evangelicals? You understand? Because Ned the Wino is the Black Jesus. And, you know, white evangelicals are not trying to feel that. They're not going to let no white Jesus, no Ned the Wino, no Black Jesus redeem them.
Was that Quincy? Was he writing on it?
No, that's my man, Larry. Larry is from Chicago, so he understands the dynamics of Chicago and what happened. He grew up on the south side of Chicago, so he understands Good Times in a real sense. Like nobody. Mm.
I want to read the paper, and I want to take the class. I'm the image of Ned the Wino as Savior is just, I'm going to really have to work on that. Wow. Just. Okay, I did write okay, let me get to the questions. I did write the questions down. So Howard, yes, we are lucky we got them Good Times. How is theological education going to be different because of us? Location, 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 social location. There are things, so like, it matters that I don't see myself in Lutheran history. Like, it matters. History is something that we create by doing and by writing, and we're in charge of creation. And we don't care for creation the way God has asked us to fully. I know those things because of my social location, and I know them in a way that isn't necessarily, I know them in a way that matters when it's not Earth Day. Like, I know them every day. I know it when I choose to I'm in Chicago. I know it when I choose to drive from the north side to the south side on a single street on Halsted. And I see the residue. It should not be residue of uprisings, but that's what's left in so many areas. And I know that there are people who, because of their social location, don't see what I see. They won't go where I go. They're not even going to add the same things together that I'm going to add. So as far as classes, I would love to teach a class that parallels enslavement on this continent with immigration. We have the years, we know that these things happened, but we don't talk about them together. We don't talk about them enough together, and I don't see it in the academy enough together. So what does it mean? So that's one of the things that I can bring, because for some reason no one else is talking about it. And not to talk about it, as a, what's the word? The manifestation of survival. Like, to talk about how terrible it was and talk about survival regardless. I feel like I'm gonna get out of my lane a little bit and get into praise and worship. There is a lot of people notice that Black churches and white churches don't worship the same. People have talked about that. Strange, right? There is a joy and a praise and a celebration that gets passed from generation to generation. Like, we're just now starting to talk about generational trauma. Like, what about generational joy? Those bringing those things into the classroom. Like, they're not just for coffee hour. One of the things, Brian, that I love so much about your talk is your respect of the artistry for Coltrane and Baldwin, and the fact that you're taking their creation seriously theologically. And I think that when we talk about creation, we've downsized it to nature, which is very important. But there are all these other pieces of creation in so many different cultures. I'm Black, so I'm talking about Black culture. But there are so many different sorts of diverse ways that God has given us to create and to connect. And my social location, my life, like I'll quit saying social location as like buzzword, my life, my lived experience, which is so important to womanism, is essential to my theology. It's essential to my scholarship. It has not been the thing that has been centered necessarily. And that's a loss. And I'm working to fix that.
Can I ask a question? Because I've heard you say social location, and I've been wondering, when you talk about that, is that just space, or is that the individual as well?
This is really interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No. That's because that's why when I was listening to your conversation, because I never would have put Sankofa with womanist. I listened to your talk earlier, and I stopped it when I heard that, and I said, "That's it. I don't need to hear any more," because that was something that blew me away. Because I never imagined it ever. It didn't. And when you said it, I was like, it makes so much sense. But I never put them together. But then you kept saying social location, and I'm saying, because as you said, I deal with the body, the person, because I believe you can't take these moments and these movements without dealing with the essential biographical essence of the person.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, how do you, when you talk about this social location aspect, are you specifically talking about, like, I live in Alabama, or I'm from Arkansas or New York, or are you saying your experience as well as being a Black womanist?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So I am talking about my experience. I'm talking about the experience of Black women, which I know which I think I said in my talk. I can't remember. Not a monolith. Not speaking for everyone. Don't expect me to speak for everyone. That said, there are experiences that translate. There are experiences that there are experiences that Black women can have and recognize in each other. There's this one sketch comedy show where, or maybe it's a part of a movie where these two Black women are looking at each other and giving each other a look, and so much is spoken in that look, from their shared experience. Even if they weren't side by side, there is still this shared experience of being a Black woman in this country that Katie Cannon was like, wait a minute, we are not talking about this. We cannot talk about what is quote unquote ethical if you think that I should be like you. This is exactly what Kevin talked about, right? So there's no monolith, but there is a shared set of experience. Sankofa really hit home to me when I remembered shopping with my mother. And from my economic background, from my background in a medium-sized Midwestern city, knowing how to grocery shop was important. There's only so much money, and we're feeding 3 people in the house. And so these sorts of knowledges are privileged for Black women that I know. And you're not going to find a class in seminary about how to shop for neck bones. Just call it what it is. This is what I was thinking of when this all came to me. But the fact that I have that experience with that store, with my mother, with that food, means that I look at history differently. And it means that I look at theology differently. And that stuff is God-given. And because, Imago Dei, Brian, like you said, Imago Dei, and I'm like, yes, it's God-given. So it's on the table. It's like what gets privileged? Well, it's Imago Dei. So I'm bringing it because God gave it to me. It was not a mistake. So it's here and I'm bringing it. And just like Kevin talked about his lenses, it's just one of my lenses. Brian, I don't even know if I answered your question, but it's economic, it's gendered. It's me sharing a meme about how you sleep after someone presses your hair on Saturday night. I mean, this kind of stuff is what I mean when I talk about social location.
That's dope.
And it's like it's part and parcel. Like that part of me isn't staying behind when I come into the academy.
Brian, are you waiting for me to say something?
Oh, I'm yes, I am.
I love it. That's the right answer.
No, the way you were looking. I'll just say this about social location and theological education. It goes back to what you said, Brian, where do you go to school? Because in the hallways and some of theological, institutions, we'll be talking about where to go to get a neck bone or those kinds of conversations happen outside of the classroom. And so that I think the work and the joy that I have about you and you, Brian, and you, Denise, and Kevin, is that you're going to be bringing something new, perhaps, to some of our institutions, or you're going to go to some places where you can even enhance your theological, prowess so that we can collectively work for the healing of our community, because there are people that don't know. There are people that don't know the relationship between womanist and Sankofa. Mm-hmm. That's being taught in some institutions. Immigration is being taught in some institutions, but some of us don't have that privilege or that exposure for the sake of our healing. And so my question is, how then do the work that we do and the joy that you bring to music, and I love jazz, and to the work that you're doing on Womanist Theology, how do you bring that for the healing of our community?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, first, it's nice to be, I want to say self-referential, but self-referential isn't it. Like Katie Cannon talks about, there's no other way to say this. She talks about keeping white people off her eyeballs. What I take from that is sort of, like I said, whose knowledge is privileged and why. We're talking Imago Dei, so let's talk Norma Normans. I mean, let's talk what's normalized in theological education. And we can't be theologically, we can't be faithful theologically having just one norm when we look at creation. So this is why I always end up back at creation. God did this. And who are we who are, so who are we to say, well, there's only one way, go back to Kevin, there's only one way to go to seminary. You have to be in your 20s, you have to move, you have to be willing to work, you have to be willing to do school without a job because it's going to be really hard to get those schedules worked out. You got to be able to like do CPE in the summer without a job. Like all those things used to work for a certain type of person coming from a certain type of family 20, 30 years ago. Seminaries are changing and it's great. We need more change. I'm lucky as a single woman to be able to have gotten through seminary. I don't know, I think I moved 4 times. It's just such a like it's a skill that has nothing to do, or an ability that has nothing to do with whether or not you can minister. Being able, so being able to break open, so if you have the ability to move 4 times and you can minister and you go into seminary, that's great. If you don't, if you're imago Dei, you're made, you're made by our creator, you're here in creation, you're a co-creator, you can't move 4 times, but you have a ministry. So certainly there's up between what God is trying to do, like in ministry, because of rules. And I'm not trying to sound like an anarchist, but there are barriers, and some of them are just there for no good reason.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and then there are also epistemological barriers too. Epistemology of Ignorance is something I talk about, that Charles Mills talks about a lot in the Racial Contract, about, and I'm going to let you speak here, Brian. I'm sorry, I'm talking.
Let your brilliance shine. You good with me? I'm over here chilling. You good?
I'm gonna try to get this thought out. I mean, the epistemology of ignorance is sort of like this agreement that Western American US society has about who's on top and who's not. Caste, basically, to Wilkerson's amazing book that everybody must read right now as soon as they finish reading the Racial Contract and whatever 45 books Brian has behind him. Go read Caste. So yeah. So I'm gonna pause and let Brian get in.
Well, I agree with everything you say. I just follow after you because your brilliance leaves a trail of magnificence. that
Brother,
every time I see you, your brilliance continues to shine.
I wish I had a notebook for your talk. You can ask people on a thing. I'm like,
I was just lost. But let me. Paul Tillich, it was actually a womanist, Gina Robinson. She went down in the stack one day and she said, Brian, here goes this book. This will change your life. And she brought me this book called Theology is Art from Paul Tillich. I just looked at the title and took the book back. I said, that's all I needed. Because I was wrestling with it, and she said, this fits you, what you're trying to wrestle with, that I didn't have the language for it. But he made one sentence. I did read one sentence, and he says theologians try to be technicians versus artists. And that changed, because Dr. Cohn was already doing that, but I hadn't seen it. He hadn't really wrote it in extensively. Into his last book, I said I wasn't going to tell anybody. But then as I started doing it, started looking through it and writing and listening, I said, this is it. And what happens with that, when you look at theology as art and not some technical thing, it has no boundaries, So when you make some theological claims, and I said, well, maybe you can be justified by something other than faith. That's artistry saying art has no boundaries, you know. Art says, that's why, you know, somebody like Sun Ra or George Clinton was like, music is endless. It goes both ways and it never stops. So I can say whatever I want to say and play whatever I want to play because it has no boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so whenever we try to say that theology has to be in our little theological frame and stop from using our own social location because it doesn't match your social location, then we stop this innovation, this imaginative way of learning.
Creativity.
You know, creativity, exactly. Like I'm very intentional about some things I do. I mean, I'm very intentional that I wear a hat when everybody sees me. Everywhere I go, I don't care how professional it is, I put a hat on because look, I want you to know this is me. You know what I'm saying? And it's something that's part of the Theo-Creative aspect of who I am. Now, some of my character will shine because that's who I am. But that social location, as you talked about, it starts to kind of take on a characterization of his own. So I love this conversation. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Denise.
I've got a question for Brian.
Go ahead. I probably have an answer.
I'm thinking about Theo-Creativity, and I'm thinking about ontology. And I'm trying to put it together in my mind. So I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, and then you tell me I'm wrong, because I'm probably wrong. So I'm thinking that Theo-Creativity is of divinity, of God, something that we can express from or through God's gift. And that in that expression, it manifests our ontology. Am I understanding it?
Yeah. When I think about it, I see where you're going, and that is it. But let me give you the story of James Baldwin. James Baldwin, and maybe this will just give you a picturesque vision of it. James Baldwin is 14, 15, 16, flunking out of school. His teacher says, I want you to go up the street and see Buford Delaney. Buford Delaney, the Black artist, world-renowned. He goes and sees Buford Delaney because understand, he's in his last year of preaching. He knocks on the door. Buford Delaney answers the door, a little short, stout, Black man with a soft voice. And Buford Delaney says, the Lord has opened up a door. That's Theo-Creativity, Theo-Creative, that God connects your life, even in the midst of what you think is failing, with something that's going to push you to be great. Because what Buford Delaney taught James Baldwin was, at that moment, he took James Baldwin in the apartment and turned on a record player and started playing Bessie Smith, old records that he had never heard because he grew up in a Pentecostal house, and it taught him how to listen. So if you ever read Baldwin's book, or you see the latest movie that came out about the boy that went to jail, I can't remember the name of it right now.
Khalif Browder?
No. The movie about James Baldwin's book. Y'all know what it is.
No.
Not the documentary, the actual movie with the sister from 227.
Oh, I know. Why can't I think of the name of it? Okay, go ahead. I know.
But you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking. But you look at the movie and you see how detailed he is about. I was watching it. Now, I don't like fiction, even though I think it's some of the most important reading. I had to, thankful for a good advisor like Dr. Ray, who was like, I'm going to teach you to read fiction. and so if you read Baldwin's fiction, it's certain things you'll know when you watch the movie. If Bill Street Could Talk, that's the name of it. Thank you. There are certain parts when they show the guy touching the lady's wrist. That's in the book, because Baldwin is very detailed because he pays attention. That's something Buford Delaney taught him because he learned how to listen. When Baldwin meets Ray Charles, Baldwin says, Ray Charles has prophetic listening. He says, though he can't see, he hears everything. So Baldwin notices these things all the time because that's something Buford Delaney taught him. So that's the Theo-Creative, is that God brings you into the space that ontologically you become who most folks thought you wouldn't become, because understand, Baldwin was failing. He was trying to figure out who he was as a Black boy, his sexuality, he was poor, and people thought he was stupid. But the truth of the matter is, this is one of the most brilliant writers, he is the most brilliant writer ever to lead the United States of America, hands down. And it comes out because he met Buford Delaney.
Wow, 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 wow. I'm so glad I asked you that, because I have a completely new, in-depth understanding. My interest in understanding and respecting all of creation, I just needed to hear this right at this time. It's just perfect. Thank you. And what an amazing story. Amazing, amazing.
And honestly, you can say the same thing about John Coltrane too. Same thing happened with him as well. John Coltrane was a horrible saxophonist.
I know that.
Yeah, he was terrible. When he was in the Air Force, he was stationed in Hawaii. They said this is one of the worst things they ever heard. Wynton Marsalis said this is downright putrid. But practice, him practicing all this time. Imagine you're one of the greatest jazz musicians, but you practice every day, 8 to 10 hours. Sonny Rollins the same way, practicing scales. I know pastors that don't even read their Bible.
Call it what it is. It's true.
30 minutes a day. And they were practicing the same scales 8 to 10 hours, because in practicing the scales, it improves improvisation. That's why cats can't preach without a manuscript, because they don't know nothing.
Say it, Brian.
I'm sorry.
Say it. Say it. Don't be sorry. Say it.
I mean, I was just being polite. But I'm sorry.
Okay.
Forgive me.
Okay. We have some questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and instead of sort of curating them, I'm wondering if y'all would take a quick look at the questions in the Q&A, answer whichever one you want to.
I had to take my glasses off. I got a little older.
You're right. Some of those numbers hit you, and you got to really kind of.
All right, I could, if I have to, I can field one. There's a question for Brian Foulks that asks about your sense of Tupac Shakur as a contemporary theologian, and there's a question for Denise about how Black women can reclaim their experiences with confidence, even when their experiences are dismissed within the Black church, not just by whites. So,
well, okay. Well, my good friend, one of my PhD colleagues, calls Tupac Shakur an opaque theologian, and it's certain things about Tupac that's interesting. If you ever read Tupac, pay attention to how Tupac deals with death. It's similar to that of Martin Luther King, and how King at his later part of his life, when he knows he's dying, Tupac, when he rhymes, you can see that he's been reading Martin Luther King. There's also aspects when you read Tupac, listen to Tupac, you can tell that he's been reading Audre Lorde, because he mentions the exact phrase from Sister Outsider in his lyrics. And if you go look at the cover of Machiavelli, you see him on the cross with his arms out. That is one of the most sacred things, especially for white evangelical Christianity. When you're in that pose, it is frightening, because if you ever take a good look at Superman when they show him in pose, he's always like this, with his arms out in the Christ, the Savior pose. And when Tupac does that, what Tupac is saying, I am the Black Christ, you know, I'm here to save all the niggas. And that frightens people, because first of all, they say, how dare you refer to yourself in that derogatory term? And he says, it's not derogatory. I'm talking about my people. You think it's derogatory because you say nigger. I'm saying nigga. And so Tupac is really addressing some real intentionalities or intentional areas that scares folks theologically and historically. Because his mother's a Black Panther, he knows all this stuff. You ain't really surprising him with anything. And so how do we get rid of his voice?
Let me ask just a follow-up. You used the phrase opaque theologian.
Yes.
Unpack that a little, please.
That comes from what's the brother, the theologian, wrote the book Ellipsis.
Oh, my mind is blank.
Y'all know his name. This whole thing about, in other words, Tupac uses things of this kind of obscure nature and pulls them out, presents them, and then kind of closes them back up where you don't notice. The only way you know it is if you roll with him. In other words, when you see a bunch of brothers roll up on each other on the street and they dap each other and you think they know each other, but they don't. They just showing love to each other, dignity and pride, DAP, D-A-P. That they just saying, we just showing respect for you, brother, in the space. Tupac, from his opaque theological stance, is doing that. He's saying things that folk in his space understand. This opaqueness is really kind of, I'm talking to folk, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, then I wasn't talking to you.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful.
So glad that you used the DAP, because that too is shared knowledge. Right. And me relating to you in a way that I can relate to you the way I can, because we both occupy the same social space. If we haven't had the exact same experience, I know what you're going through, or I know what you've been through, or I know what you're about to go through. All of that. So the question about Black women and reclaiming experience with confidence and multifaceted tensions. Yes, intersectionality is a thing, and how to claim your selfhood, your complex God-made, God-given selfhood, right? And if I always have to go back to that Imago Dei piece, because it's what gives me the confidence to continually claim and reclaim who and what I am, regardless. And the regardless, I'm not just tossing in the regardless part of Alice Walker's definition of what a womanist is and what a womanist does. And I'm not going to get it exactly right. It's a 4 or 5 part definition, and one part is loves roundness, loves women sexually and non-sexually, loves people, loves herself, period, regardless, period. And the regardless is italicized, and it's its own word in its own sentence. That's not a real sentence because it's no verb, but whatever. It's another knowledge that it's another way of imparting knowledge that may not be privileged by everybody who knows how to diagram sentences and all that stuff. But there's something about the regardless that I think provides the strength to, and I know why, I'm just trying to finish the sentence, that provides the strength to do what it is a womanist needs to do, which is a really wide and maybe not a very clear, it doesn't sound clear, but it will in a minute. Because, and I've learned this through reading, and I've learned this when I didn't realize how important it was to shop for neck bones. And I've learned this from my mentor on the call, Dr. Wallace. When you stand up, when you are asserting, when you are reclaiming with confidence, you're not just doing it for yourself. You're doing it for the women who also need to do it. You're doing it for the women in the past who maybe were not able to do it the same way you can. You're doing it so that people coming after you can do it and not have to work as hard. The regardless doesn't have to be as big. And when you start to think about the interconnectedness of why you do what you do, when you're in ministry, when you're serving in church, when you're in academia, when you're with your family, when you start thinking about the why, when it starts becoming bigger than Denise, that's where the strength comes from. And that is what I was trying, part of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about, here's what Alice Walker did for Zora Neale Hurston, and here's how Alice Walker's love for Zora Neale Hurston impacted Katie Cannon. And then, I have mentors who, like Katie Cannon, were taught by James Cohn. So there's this real passing on that becomes a reason to be strong, a reason to be confident, because it's not just about you. And I'm not and I can say that, I can kind of rattle that off in, like, I don't know, 90 seconds or whatever. Like, I'm just putting this together. Like I'm just like you reading it is one thing. You read Black Womanist Ethics and you're like, yeah, okay, I'm seeing myself. This is great. But then, 18 months later, it hits you. The women who did what a womanist had to do so that I can do what God has given me to do. And then we can connect that to the Theo-Creativity in the moment that Brian is talking about. We can connect that to the strength to look under the hood and say what needs to be said. Both those things that Kevin talked about, all of that. It's a synergy. It's like yeast. It's like leaven. It's like that story where there's not enough yeast, but there's enough.
we're coming to the end of the hour, and there's a question in the Q&A that seems like a good wrap-up one. It's referring back to what Pastor Foulks said about the relationship between James Baldwin and Buford Delaney. And the question to all of you is, who is your Buford, and what was your Buford moment?
Oh, wow. I think for me, it's not just one person. It was a couple moments. It could be when I was in undergrad, and all my close friends were hardcore drug dealers, but they were made sure that I didn't do that. If they were going somewhere they said, look, we're going to do something. You can't go with us, church boy. You stay here. I mean, I had a friend punch me in my mouth to say, you can't go. But they always took care of me. If I needed something, it's like, this is not for you. You have bigger aspirations and dreams than this. That was one. And then the next one was my best friend saying, after I came back from my last year playing professional sports, he said, you need to go to seminary. From there, it was a brother named Dr. Earl Fisher. We knew mutual people. We were talking on the phone one day. I had a bachelor's degree, and he said, Foulks, you need to go get a Ph.D. I was like, man, I don't even have a master's degree. It'll take me 10 years to get that. This was in 2004 when we had that conversation. And I said, I'll probably lose everything if I do go get a Ph.D. Him. And then, the folks that lived in the area when I got to Chicago, Bryson White, James Hill, Gina Robinson, all those folks, constantly, because we lived right in the same area, always meeting and always holding each other accountable. And lastly, it's Dr. Stephen Ray, who constantly, he said, when I was at Garrett, he said, look, I'll be here with you. He told my wife this more than me, because I was going to LSTC, and he said, look, I'll be here with you. I don't care if you go to LSTC, I'll be here with you. And my wife said, we're going to Garrett. So it was my wife's decision to go to Garrett because of what Dr. Ray said. And he spoke so violently, and I say that in a good way, into my life, because I don't respect a lot of people like I respect him, because not only is he brilliant, but he's real in your face and real honest about how he feels. And he's like, I'll be there with you. And even through some of even the tough times at Garrett, and when he became the president of CTS, he was like, you need to slide over here. Because I can work with you better over here at CTS. And so all those moments together were kind of this kairotic Buford Delaney moment for me.
Terrific. Thank you.
Wow, those names you're lifting up, yes. And I'm nervous that I'm not going to call all the names.
This isn't the Academy Awards. It's okay.
Okay, thank you. But people who tell you have to go to seminary, man, because that's how I ended up in seminary. Someone told me that I was supposed to go, and I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about, because that's not a thing that I'm gonna do. And I told God I wasn't going to seminary. So you see how that worked out for me. Now it's so great. If I had to pick, gosh, it would probably be me wandering into a visit to a seminary, and what happened on that visit when I literally said, I think I want to go to seminary, but I want to write, and the world doesn't need another book. I literally said the word. And a good friend and graduate who's now a pastor in Iowa took me into the sacristy and showed me some books. And on my way there, I just had this beginning of understanding of this path. I had no clue. I was dissatisfied in my professional life. It was just so I in my admissions essay for seminary, I said that I'm like the turtle on the fence post that no one knows how it got there. And that's kind of how it seemed to me. And there are so many Bufords, like literally from grade school, mentors, teachers who just kept pouring into me when I thought that I was going to hit a dead end. And I can't, there's no way to even begin to thank the list of people that have poured into me. And so I just want to be able to pour that back out.
Let me say one last person. I forgot about him. He's the main reason that I'm probably on this conversation talking to you all, and that's Dr. James Thomas. He introduced me to the Lutheran Church. I was like, man, ain't no way in hell I'll do that. And he actually pulled me to the side. He said it would be a good reason, good idea, and a good look. He says, because you may need the Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church needs you. And I said, nope, it doesn't need Brian. And he stuck with it. And he said, go do a PhD as well. He was another person that spoke that to me years ago.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Really
Can I just say my three real quick? Because one is there in Columbus, Ohio, and that's Jocelyn Bennett, who knew me even before I even thought about going to seminary. I was doing my first master's in child development, and so she introduced me to the National Council of Churches Black Family Ministry Project, and so I was one of those who made my way into that cohort. And then there was Andrea Walker, who, when I was living here in North Carolina, was contemplating going to seminary. She told me to come to Atlanta. And so I went there and took my courses at the Lutheran Theological Center in Atlanta. Of course, you had to do your Lutheran year or semester. And so that's why I graduated from Southern Seminary. And then someone who I just spoke to just this evening, Dr. Jacqueline Grant. Every time I talk to her, I still get nervous. And she's just as sweet and kind as she can be. And I remember meeting her in North Carolina at Bennett College, where she was doing a lecture on her book that came out because she was classmates with Katie Cannon, and both of them went to ITC. And so the connection between Dr. Grant and ITC, and then I'm going there to this day. She has my heart. So
thank you for calling those names. And my copy of Black Womanist Ethics must be on the other side of the room. But I've been going through this one recently, so I do have Dr.
Yeah, she was my professor of systematic theology.
See, this is yes. I know we're over, so
yeah, I know CCU too.
What has been beautifully unexpected, I think, in how you've responded to the question is the reinforced sense of community. It takes a village, not only to raise a child, but to raise a pastor and a theologian, right? And especially with the references, to, Cohn not seeing himself in Niebuhr and so forth. And Katie Geneva Cannon not seeing herself in James Cohn. So much of the history of the white Western Academy has been the doctor father, right? That the thought is that you are made in the mold of the one important person you study with, which is just crap. You know, life's more complex than that. And the influences that we have, just as you've talked, several of you, I've been amazed by the threads of creativity. Certainly explicitly, Brian, with you in lifting up Coltrane and Baldwin. And I love the fact that their pictures are right behind you as you talk with us, right? And then Denise, you pointing out the literary work Katie Geneva Cannon did. And Dr. Wallace, you're incorporating music and art into your presentation as well. There's just so much more to this than the history of ideas. And it's lived experience, and it's lived people, and it's relationship. And that's, I think, just a wonderful point to wrap up with. A reminder again, we have worship at 10:30 in the morning on this same Zoom URL. We have the Womanist Theology conversation with Dr. Wallace and Ms. Rector and a few other guest womanists appearing at 2:30. And then there are the separate sign-up links if you wish to be a part of the discernment conversations open to African ascent folks. Or no, I'm going to start saying that now. I like that, African descent. And then also a Bible study. So the discernment conversations and the Bible study, you sign up for separately, just so you can be in a room where you can actually participate instead by more than just typing in the chat as you've been doing. Again, thank you all so much. This conversation was even richer than I could have imagined. And certainly the two of us whose faces you see who have PhDs are really excited to have the other two of you join our ranks. So.
And maybe even replace us.
Yeah, finish fast, we're tired.
Well, thank you. I'm so thankful to have Brian and Kevin alongside on the journey. Thank you for having me. And Brian, man, I miss you. It's so good to be
Same here.